Ron Robinson. He'll be speaking on D-Day, and without any more introduction, there you go, Ron.
Well, all right. Well, thank you, and thank all of you for being here. And if I don't talk loud enough, just raise your hand and or put a thumbs up, and we'll try to talk a little louder. First of all, thank you for having me, and it's so pleased to have all of you here to talk about one of our country's most significant military events, certainly in history. Many people would argue it probably is one of two or three of the top military events that we've had. You have in your hands three pieces of paper. I think everybody's got one. And I wanted to start by doing just a little bit of overview and talking about these pieces of paper first. The first sheet is the actual organizational chart of the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force. That's SHAEF, that's what that stands for, on June 6, 1944. And it's nothing more than to give you some idea of who the leaders were. And then the second page is merely pictures of these, most of these folks, and what positions they held on D-Day. And so you might hear me talking about some of these, but for the most part, this is just an overview of the organizational structure for D-Day. Now, the third piece is important to you because today we're not going to be talking a great deal about the military aspects of D-Day, in large part due to the fact that you need a lot of military maps, you need to understand a lot of military lingo, and so I decided to do something a little bit different in talking about D-Day. There are literally hundreds of heroes of D-Day from both England and the other Allied powers, plus obviously the United States. We could talk all day long about the men who ultimately sacrificed their lives or survived and came back home. But what I decided to do was to pick out 6 actions that occurred on D-Day that you might find interesting militarily. And so that's what we're going to do. And this map has them all marked of where they landed at D-Day and has their names. So that's the people that we're going to be talking about today. Now, before we get started, I want to tell you that I am a trained historian, but I've never written a book. I have not done a documentary. So I am a student of history. And the 2 areas that I'm a student of is World War II and specifically D-Day, and secondly, the Civil War. And so those are the 2 things that I go out and talk about. In part, I decided to focus on D-Day because as a kid growing up in the 1950s, almost every adult male in my little town of 1600 was a veteran of D-Day. My brother-in-law was a paratrooper in the military during World War II. And while he didn't jump at D-Day, he was involved in a bridge too far. The Arnhem paratrooper drops later on after D-Day. So I heard from him over the years about his service in the military. You might ask the question to get started, why did it all occur on June 6th? 1944. Why didn't it occur in 1943? Why didn't it occur in 42? The war started for the United States in December of 1941. So why didn't we invade France sooner? There are some who might say, well, General Eisenhower was in charge, Why didn't he go earlier? Well, the reason is fairly simple. Neither the United States nor Great Britain had the military ability to invade France, northern France, any time before June of 1944. In fact, there's some historians who say they still weren't ready in June. They could have delayed it even a couple more months. In addition, our good friends, the British, were very much opposed to any kind of invasion of France or Europe, for that matter. They objected to it and wanted to delay it as long as they could. Why? Again, they weren't prepared. Second, the British lost in World War I right at 500,000 men. And their losses were so severe that it impacted the birth rate of Great Britain. And when you carry that forward, there were fewer British soldiers to fight in World War II than they would have had they not lost all of those troops. Eisenhower had nothing to do with it. Eisenhower was not named commander of D-Day until December, late November, December of 1943. So he had led the invasion of North Africa. He was still in charge when they invaded Sicily. He was still in charge when they invaded Italy. But he wasn't in charge of D-Day. Everybody thought it was going to be George C. Marshall, who was the chief of staff of the U.S. Army. But for a lot of reasons, he was not selected, and Eisenhower got the command. Well, with that, then let's get started with the stories. This is an interesting slide, and you can't see much of it up there, I'm sorry to say. But basically what this slide tells us is this is where all the troops came from to get to Normandy. This is Normandy, this is southern England, this is the English Channel. And this slide tells you where all these troops left from and how, and each of these lines will take you to a Normandy beach. By the way, any of these slides after we're over with, if you want copies of them, I'll be happy to get copies for you and deliver them to the museum and you can pick them up. Because I know that some of you might be interested in some of this. And by the way, all of this is on the web too. You can find it on the web. So this simply says, how did they get started? Where did they leave from? How did they go through the English Channel? And where they landed. Now there's an interesting, this is another slide, but it shows a thing called a Piccadilly Circus. It's an interesting phenomenon. You had to get all of these troops, you had to get it was supposed to be 175,000 men were to land right here. So you had to figure out a way to put them on all these ships and get them over there. Well, the solution was to gather all of these ships, and there's some 3,000 to 4,000 ships that were not carrying troops, that were doing a variety of other things. Well, they were carrying troops, I'm sorry. And they gathered in this area called Piccadilly Circus. It's about 25, 30 miles diameter. And they circled, and they went through a variety of exercises to get all lined up so they could take all of these men into the beaches. And there's a lot been written about Piccadilly Circus, and there's a lot of photographs of it if you want to get up on the line and look at it. So where did they go? Well, this is a closer view, and you can't see it, but it's in French. It's one of the best slides that I've seen of the beaches. And the U.S. armies were on Omaha and Utah, and the British and the Canadians here in the middle, so it was British, Canadian, British, were on Gold, Juno, and Sword. And that's the way they invaded. Why were the Americans over here, and why were the British over here? It's because where they trained and where they were housed in England. The American troops were on the west side of England. That's how they came over from the United States. They landed on the west side. They went into barracks and bivouacs and so forth on the west. So that's where they were. The Brits were on the east. Why? Because Hitler was going to invade England from the east, across the narrow part of the English Channel. So the Brits were over there trying to get prepared to be invaded by Germany. So they ended up on the east side, so they're on the what would be the east side of the whole Normandy beach. So, one more slide about the beach and then we'll get off of it. If you see these little marks, you can't read any of them. Those are called beach sectors. You'll hear, if you read about Normandy and the invasion, you'll hear about Dog Red and Dog Green and Atlantic and so on and so forth. Each one of these are little sectors here and they all have names, and every man that landed on D-Day landed on the sector beach. And you'll hear about that all the time when you read about the invasion. So how'd they get there? They got there on a boat called a Higgins Boat. And if any of you have been to New Orleans to World War II Museum, you've seen a Higgins Boat. You come in the front door and there's one there, right inside the front door. A man by the name of Higgins in Louisiana designed a boat back in the 1930s that would go through the swamps. And when you finally hit some mushy bank where you could stop the boat, you put the, got the wrong thing here. You put the ramp down, and then you walk onto this marshy land from the swamp. Well, why did it work good for landing troops at D-Day? And virtually all troops for at least the first 8 to 10 hours landed on these boats. Maybe a little less than that, maybe 6 to 8 hours. Why? Because we landed at low tide. We didn't land at high tide. So you had to get in as close as you could, and you actually grounded these boats. And the men got out. You can see the men here actually splicing along on the sand, and here's the boat. And the propellers were hidden in the back in such a way that they wouldn't grind down in the sand and they could back them off. Now, it's not all true that they came in that way. There was many, when the front of the boat came down, they weren't in where it was shallow, and the men went in. Some of them even drowned because they told them to get off the boat earlier than they should have. Okay, here's an actual shot of a Higgins boat with the ramp down and the men getting off. This is Omaha Beach, and these are some of the barricades that the Germans had put out to prevent the boats from landing. Okay, now this is an interesting sheet you can find online. If you go to the Encyclopedia Britannica, they have several of these. But all of this is actually the slide that I showed you earlier. But all of this represents what happened on D-Day. 129,000 men actually landed on D-Day. And then another 23,000 were airborne troops of both the British and the Americans who landed. The Americans landed over on the west. The Brits landed over on the east. Some 3,000 landing craft. Those were what I was talking about, got all of those soldiers to shore. Now later there were some bigger craft that landed later in the day, later in the evening, when the fire from the beaches, when the shooting from the beaches died down, they brought in the larger ships that held several hundred men. At the end of June, to give you some idea how massive this effort was, they had landed 850,000 men at Normandy. And they started June 6th with one. And if you stop and think about that, and divide it by the number of days, and then divide it by the number of hours, and then by the number of minutes, they were landing literally thousands a minute to make it. 1,200 a minute. I'm sorry, I told you wrong. Let me think about that. But it is a huge number of people who ended up landing before the end of June. And by the way, by the end of August, they had put over 2 million men ashore. So the build-up to D-Day was not only D-Day, they had to get there, and they had to get control of the beaches, and they had to begin moving inward. But they had to also have lined up millions of men, and all of the equipment, and all the support stuff, because they knew it was going to take that many to continue the fight and head through northern France over to the Rhine River, and they made that by late fall of 1944. Okay, so the end result of it all, there it is. When it's all said and done, there were 550,000 men killed, wounded, or missing through the end of August, maybe the first part of September. Germany had the largest number. Why? Because they were on the defensive. So as the Allies moved forward, they retreated, and they had to leave a lot of wounded behind, had to leave a lot of dead behind. So they lost 30,000 killed. The United States lost 29,000 killed. So the kill between Germany and the U.S. was about the same. Britain, 11,000 killed. So you can see the U.S. was nearly 3-to-1 deaths to the British. And then, of course, Canada was fewer, and in France, France had 12,000 civilians killed or missing during the invasion. Okay, now we're going to start the stories. And I'm going to do it a little different. I'm going to show you some slides, and I'm going to read the stories. Why? Because the historians that have written this can write it much better than I can tell it. And those of you who've heard me speak before, I normally talk, but I'm going to read. This is the first story. And this is the Pointe du Hoc. Those of you might remember Ronald Reagan's speech at Pointe du Hoc, one of the most memorable speeches ever given. Pointe du Hoc is a promontory, obviously. This is a modern version. And it sits between Utah Beach and Lomail Beach, and it is number 1 on your map, by the way. And the Germans had put 5 huge guns right there. And those guns were aimed so they could enfilade the Utah Beach, and they could swing them around, and they could fire down the Omaha Beach. In the planning for D-Day, they tried to take them out, and if you will look closely, you see those dark spots? Those are all shell holes of planes trying to bomb all of this and trying to hit this and blow it up. They were unable to do that. When I was there and I've been to D-Day 3 times, when I was there in the 2004, I think, was the last time I was there, these craters were still so deep you couldn't walk down them, some of them. So they were that massive. They were 10, 12 feet deep. Now, I want you to think about this. This is where the troops landed, and we're going to read this to you in a minute. They landed here on this side, and these cliffs are 100 feet, and they landed on this side. This slide is actually looking south. And so they came up these cliffs, they come up these cliffs. They landed on this beach, and they landed at, the beach there is only about 10 or 15 feet wide, maybe 20 feet wide. But I want you to look at this road right here, because we're going to talk about it here in a minute. This is actually modern day concrete walkways for the tourists to walk around and see everything. And since I've been there, they would let us come up and look inside here, and I think they've stopped that now because there's massive erosion going on here, and at some point in time this is probably going to fall into the ocean. Bud Lomail. He is best known for his actions in the first hours of D-Day at Pointe du Hoc. Pointe du Hoc was the site of the German Army's largest coastal weapons, 5 155 millimeter German guns with a 25-kilometer range that endangered tens of thousands of troops landing on Omaha and Utah Beach, and thousands of watercraft in the English Channel supporting the invasion. Lomail was recognized by historian Stephen Ambrose as the single individual, other than Dwight D. Eisenhower, most responsible for the success of D-Day. 6 months later, in the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, he would again distinguish himself, earning a Silver Star for his heroism and leadership as the 2nd Ranger Battalion captured and held Hill 400. The initial mission of companies D, E, and F of the 2nd Ranger Battalion was one of the most difficult of the entire invasion. There were 220 men landed at Pointe du Hoc, almost equally split between both sides of the point. Scaling sheer cliffs of Pointe du Hoc, these are the Ranger Battalion, one of the most difficult of the entire invasion, scaling sheer cliffs of Pointe du Hoc, seizing control of its massively reinforced fortifications, and disabling the 555 Miller cannon. Their landing was scheduled to coincide with the first landings on Omaha Beach was 6 a.m. They were to land at 6 a.m. At 24, Lomail was the acting commander for Battalion D Company. Due to heavy seas and the fog of battle, Lomail's landing craft arrived 35 minutes late, away from its mark, and lost any element of surprise. Those who made it down the ramp or over the side had to swim inland about 20 feet, as Lomail was bringing a box of rope and a hand projector rocket. He was wounded in the side by a machine gun bullet, but reached shore without pausing. A hand projector rocket was a rocket that fired, and when it fired, it shot a rope up over 100 feet, and on the end of the rope was a grappling hook. That's not the right word, but it's a hook, like a huge fishing hook, with 3 prongs. And it would land on the dirt, they'd pull the rope, the hook would catch, and that's what they'd climb up the side of the 100-foot cliff. D Company's specific objectives were to take the 3 western gun emplacements and then to assemble to the south edge of the fortified area to control the coastal road so as to prevent the German reinforcements from reaching Omaha Beach from the west. That would be back this direction. Aerial naval bombardment of the Pointe du Hoc area designed to destroy the guns and their defenses and defenders had turned the landscape into a moonscape. However, as the Army's official account of the battle later stated, one party after another reached the allotted emplacement. To make the same discovery, there were no signs of the guns inside the fortification. They'd been removed. Evidently, the 155s had been removed from the point before the period of major bombardments. After First Sergeant Lomail's company took up positions along both edges of the coastal highway to prepare for the expected reinforcements, Lomail and Staff Sergeant Jack Coon formed a patrol to head down a double hedge road lane. We think it's this one right here, and the coastal road is right in here somewhere. Lomail saw markings in this sunken road that looked like something heavy had been over it. Lomail and Coon found 5 of the missing 155s concealed under camouflage in an orchard. Less than 100 yards away were German troops at rest. In Lomail's word, it was pure, dumb luck. The guns had been placed in a position to fire toward Utah Beach and were capable of being switched for use against Omaha Beach, with Sergeant Coon covering him against possible defenders. First Sergeant Lomail went into the battery and set off silent thermite grenades in the mechanisms of 2 guns. Because the thermite grenades melted their gears in a moment, they effectively disabled them. After bashing in a third gun sights, Lomail went back to somewhere on this point and got more grenades and come back and finish the job. Bud Lomail. This is another view of Point du Hoc, and you can see the cliffs and how steep they were. There was 220 some men went in, and at the end of the fight for Port du Hoc, which ended up taking 2 or 3 days, there was 90 of them left that was uninjured. 90 of 200 some. That's a picture of it. He went by the name of Bud, and he was a graduate of Tennessee Wesleyan University. And his hometown, Point Pleasant Beach, New Jersey. And his rank was a 2nd lieutenant, and I think he even had one advantage, 2nd lieutenant for this one. And after the war, he became an attorney in Toms River, New Jersey. And he died, he was born in 1920, and he died in 1911. So he hadn't been gone that long. If you see any documentaries about Point du Hoc that lists any of the survivors, you'll see Lomail. A very modest man. Okay. So there's a couple other things that relates to Point du Hoc you might find interesting. This is actually taken on D-Day, and this is one of the cliffs of Point du Hoc, and I believe it's over on the west side or on the right of the photograph. And these are the Rangers. And right across the top here are 4 German prisoners, and this guy is guarding them, and that they brought them in. They put the U.S. flag up. There's some injured men right in here that you can't see very well. You can see it better on the printed page. But that's how difficult Point du Hoc was. Now here's another interesting fellow. Any of you heard of James Earl Rudder? James Earl Rudder is a Texan. James Earl Rudder was from Brady, Texas. James Earl Rudder was a lieutenant colonel at the time of Point du Hoc. He led the Rangers. He was in charge. He was the one that made all the decisions. They were very close to being totally wiped out. And before they landed, I should have said this first, the boats got off track and they were headed toward another point on Omaha Beach. And the people running the boats were going to land them there. He said, no, you're taking us to Point du Hoc. And he led the entire process. He later gets promoted, ends up retiring as a major general out of the U.S. Army. Now, the interesting thing about him is he makes a very fundamental decision about the state of Texas that's still with us today. He ends up being president of Texas A&M University. And for many years, they knew they were going to have to start admitting women. But nobody had the courage to do it. He had such a reputation and was so highly regarded as a hero in the state of Texas, he decided to admit women to Texas A&M University, and he got the job done, and the first women were enrolled in '69. As a result, Texas A&M is one of the top 5 universities in the United States in terms of enrollment. Unfortunately, he dies at the age of 59 of a massive heart attack. So he didn't have, and that was in, I forgot what year that was, but anyway, so all of this started with him at Point in Rock. Norman Coda. Brigadier General Norman Coda is standing next to Dwight Eisenhower, and it's at a meeting that occurred later on in the war. But he was a brigadier general, and he landed in the second wave. He's number 2 on your list. You can see where he landed. Coda went ashore with the second wave 1 hour after the initial assault on Dog White. Remember I talked about the segments? Dog White sector of Omaha Beach with part of the 116th Regiment of the 29th Division. Omaha Beach and Bearville Brawl was concave, and the natural outline allowed the Germans to pour fire down on a cone on the assault troops. The way Omaha Beach was defended, the way that the German army decided to defend it is to face most of the guns to enfilade the beach. So don't fire across the beach, fire down the beach. And so the cone thing is merely a representation of that. If you were in an amphitheater like a cone and the troops were landing down on stage and you were at the top row of the amphitheater and you could shoot down on them, you could shoot at them from all 3 sides. That's basically what the situation was on Dog White Beach. Now the Bearville draw, there were a bunch of draws on Omaha Beach, and the draw was nothing more than a dry ravine where when it rained in Normandy, the rivers ran into the English Channel, and they'd run to a certain point and go down through the 100-foot cliffs and go down to the water, and if it wasn't raining, they were dry. Well, the Bearville draw was one of the objectives of the 116th Regiment. You're going to take that draw and control it. The first wave was ineffective and pinned down. Coda's landing craft come under heavy machine gun fire, and the first 3 men to disembark were killed as they exited the boat. Mortar and artillery fire was also raining down on the crews. Coda tried to rally his shell-shocked men. He strode upright and willed them to fight. He uttered the words, "Gentlemen, we're being killed on the beaches. Let's go inland and be killed." Not much of an encouraging statement, is it? Another quote attributed to Coda: "There are 2 kinds of people who are staying on these beaches, those that are dead and those that are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." But with the situation in Omaha hanging in the balance, Coda strode upright to a group of men huddled in the sand. "What outfit is this?" Coda asked, still standing upright. "5th Rangers," he was told. "Well, God damn it, Rangers, lead the way." That became the Rangers' motto. History was born, and it still is their motto today. Coda first said it on the beaches of Omaha. Coda supervised men placing a Bangalore torpedo under barbed wire. It's a torpedo that's maybe 25 foot long. You blow it up and it blows up 25 feet of stuff. Blowing it up and creating a path for the men to get off the beach. The first soldier to attempt it was killed by a German sniper. The rest of the men froze. Coda jumped to action. Joseph Balkowski, a soldier from the 29th, authored the book Beyond the Beachhead, the 29th Infantry Division in Normandy. He recalled, Coda leaped up, dashed across the road, up through the gap. Eventually a steady stream of soldiers followed him up the beach, and he led that column into the village of Bearville, Slovak, shouting to the last man, "Where in the hell you boys been?" They were following him. Coda asked later on, the next day, troops were driving inland and he came across a unit pinned down by German fire from a farmhouse. Stephen Ambrose, in his excellent book, Citizen Soldiers, the U.S. Army from the Normandy beaches to the Bulge to the surrender of Germany, tells what happened next. Coda asked the captain in command why his men weren't trying to take the house. "Sir, the Germans are in there shooting at us," the captain said. "Well, I'll tell you what, Captain," said Coda, unbuckling 2 grenades from his jacket. "You and your men start shooting at them. I'll take a squad of men, and you and your men watch carefully. I'll show you how to take a house with Germans in it." Coda led his squad around a hedge to get as close as possible to the house. Suddenly he gave a whoop and raced forward, the squad following, yelling like wild men. As they tossed grenades into the windows, Coda and another man kicked in the front door. This is a brigadier general, by the way. Tossed a couple of grenades inside, waited for the explosions, then dashed into the house. The surviving German soldiers inside were streaming out the back door. Coda turned to the captain. You've seen how to take a house," said the general, still out of breath. "Do you understand? Do you know how to do it now?" "Yes, sir." "Well, I won't be around to do it for you again," Coda said. "I can't do it for everybody." Norman Coda. Another picture of Coda. This is later on in the war, and he's the guy that's got a star on his helmet. And here's some of his soldiers, and they apparently have a sack of food or something. He's got his arm in there getting something to eat. He ends up, he became very much of a hero over what just happened. But later on in the war, he's in charge of the 28th Division, and they have a major disaster on the front, and he loses some of the luster, and he was blamed for some of it. And he also reviewed the conviction of Eddie Slovak. I think I'm getting that right. Slovak was the first American soldier to be convicted of cowardice in World War II. And he was executed. And Coda was one of the generals involved in that process. Okay, number 3 on your list, the Bedford Boys. Now this is not about one, it's about 22 men. And that photograph right there is of 11 of them. And 11 of them were killed on the first wave D-Day in a matter of 5 to 10 minutes. And this is the story about the Bedford Boys. One of the American units at the forefront of the invasion was a National Guard infantry unit based out of the small town of Bedford, Virginia. 3,600 people when the war began. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Division. When the company assaulted Omaha Beach that morning, there were 35 soldiers from the town assigned to the unit. By the end of the day, I told you 11. 19 of the soldiers would be dead, with 4 more dying before they get into the campaign. 19 died in a matter of 10, 15 minutes. On that day, the town of Bedford, located just below the Blue Ridge Mountains, suffered the greatest proportion of losses of any town in the United States. And the men were forever immortalized as the Bedford Boys. While approaching the beach, 6 to 7 foot waves rocked the boats as naval guns and artillery firing off other transports launched shells overhead hitting the beaches. When the U.S. boats reached within 400 yards of the beach, the German defenders began firing artillery and mortar rounds at the boats as the crafts came closer to shore. Boat 5 was the first craft sunk before reaching the beach. 6 soldiers of Company A drowned along with the boat crew, but 20 of the soldiers were later rescued. As the rest of the fleet continued toward the shore, Boat 3 was hit. Several were killed during the blast and another dozen drowned. Now these weren't all Bedford boys, they were part of that unit. As Boat 2 hit the beach, those aboard realized that the beach was untouched. Allied bombs and artillery were supposed to create shell holes for cover, but the pilots were afraid to hit the Americans and they overflew their targets, and they dropped their bombs in cow pastures instead of on the beach. It's another story. They had therefore released their bombs much further in. Once the boats hit the shore and the ramps dropped, there was nowhere for the soldiers to go, and the awaiting German machine guns tore into the Americans. Many of the men were killed on their craft ramp as they tried running off. The initial objective was to get off the beach, but many never made it. The remaining craft landed on the beach. Boat 7 drifted toward the shore with a dead coxswain and at the wheel and a 17-man medical section trapped on board. In less than 10 minutes after the first boat hit the beach, Company A was essentially destroyed. Within an hour, only a few soldiers from Company A were able to continue. They crawled across the sand and stayed at the seawall trying to survive. Once the day was over, Company A had suffered more than 90% casualties, with only 18 soldiers from Company A's initial 230 unhurt. 18 of 230. Within a few days, 4 more would die in combat. Now I'm going to read you a poem that was written. There were 2 sets of twins from Bedford. One set, one of them was killed, and one lived. He wrote a poem. I prayed for our future. That wonderful, that wonderful place called home. But sinner's prayer wasn't answered, so I'll now have to go there alone. Oh, brother, I think of you all through the sleepless night. Dear Lord, he took you from me, and I can't believe it was right. This world is so unfriendly. To kill is now a sin. To walk that long, narrow road, it can't be done without him. Dear mother, I knew your worries. This is an awful fight. To lose my only twin brother and suffer the rest of my life. Now, fellows, take my warning. Believe it from start to end. If you ever have a twin brother, don't go to war with him. So, the other part of the story, if you stop and think about it, somehow the city of Bedford, Virginia, has to know what happened. The way the military operated in those days, when your son was killed or missing, is you got a telegram from the Secretary of War. And so June 6th, all this happens, and they don't hear much in Bedford, Virginia. Toward the end of the month, they hear that maybe one man had been killed, but they didn't know who. But on July 17th, there was a lady running the Western Union office in a drugstore. And the Western Union had to connect with Roanoke and log on, so to speak. And then Roanoke would start sending stuff down to Bedford, telegrams. And when she logged on, Roanoke said, "Good morning, we have casualties." And in the next hour or so, 11 telegrams came in, each identifying a man that was killed. 11 of the 19. The rest of them came in the next day or so. There's a book by Alex Kershaw called The Bedford Boys. If you're interested in following up, I would encourage you to get it. It's an extremely well-written book. And there's not as much known about them being killed. An equal portion of the book is about what happened in Bedford, Virginia, and how the town reacted to all of this. And it went on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And I won't get into any of it, but it's worth reading if you really want to understand the sacrifices of war. Bedford, Virginia is the place to go. As a result, many years later, Bedford, Virginia became the D-Day Museum. And it's a wonderful place. If you haven't been there, I'd encourage you to go. And it's very, very well done. It's in the foothills. It's south of Roanoke, I think. Okay, these are the Bedford Boys, the 19 that were killed on D-Day. And this fellow right here, it was the guy who was in command. His name was Taylor Fellows. And he actually predicted that most of his men would get killed when they landed. He was very, very, very concerned. And he was, most of these bodies were never recovered. This is the pictures of some of them in training. You know, typical U.S. soldiers, laughing, joking. This is the last one of them who passed away about 4 years ago. He survived, and he lived with it for all of these years. Okay. What you have in front of you is an aerial photograph of what is called the Pegasus Brief. And what you see in this photograph is, this is a river. This is the Orne River, and this is the C-A-E-N canal. These are a bunch of gliders who have landed as part of an event that doesn't relate to what I'm going to tell you about, but this is the story of Pegasus Bridge. Now, and that is number 4 on your map. Okay? On the night of June 5th, a force of 181 men led by Major John Howard took off from RAF Tarrant Rushton in Dorset, southern England, in 6 Horsa gliders to capture Pegasus Bridge and also another bridge called Horsa. A few hundred yards to the east over the Orne River. The force was composed of D Company, so on and so forth. The object of this action was to prevent German armor from crossing the bridges and attacking the eastern flank leading to Sword Beach. This shot is actually, these two rivers run north and south, or the river and the canal. And so it's looking basically north. Omaha Beach is over here. This is off the left flank of Omaha Beach. And so this is what's got to be protected to keep the German forces from crossing over here. So that's what they were doing out there. 5 of the Ox in Buck's gliders, and that was the name of the British unit that landed as close as 47 yards from their objectives, 16 minutes past midnight. Now they flew from England in total darkness, were cut loose from their tow plane in total darkness, and guided those planes within 47 yards and landed them within 47 yards of that bridge. Amazing story. They lost 2 men. The attackers poured out of their battered gliders, completely surprising the German defenders, and took the bridges within 10 minutes, took both of them. They lost 2 men in the process, Lieutenant Dan Brotheridge and Lance Corporal Fred Greenlaw. Greenlaw drowned in a nearby pond when his glider landed. Brotheridge was mortally wounded crossing the bridge in the first minute of the assault and became the first Allied casualty death as a result of enemy fire on D-Day. So he was the first person to die. He's a British fellow. One glider assigned to the capture of the Orme River Bridge landed at the bridge over the River Deeds, some 7 miles off. Most of the soldiers in this glider moved through the German lines towards the village of Randville, which is very close to the bridge, Pegasus Bridge, where they eventually rejoined the British forces. The Oxen Bucks were reinforced at 0300 hours by another unit and linked up with the beach landing forces with the arrival of Lord Lomail's commandos. Remember that, because we're going to talk about it. Among the 1st of the 7th Battalion reinforcements was Lieutenant Richard Todd, a young actor who nearly 2 decades later would play Major Howard in the film The Longest Day. So the guy was actually there, ends up being in the film about it sometime later. Now, that's basically the story. But I wanted you to see just how close they were to Pegasus Bridge. There's the gliders. Can you see them right there? And there's the bridge. The absolutely amazing feat was how they left from England and flew of a night in a glider that you can't control that much. You can't turn it too much this way or that way, or it loses its, it'll fall from the sky. They landed that close, and the German forces controlling both bridges were very much surprised. Why? Because gliders don't make any noise. So they didn't do anything, and they landed. And nobody, one person was killed, but of the 3 that landed here, none of them were killed. So then, well, I guess I better turn it the right way. Okay. I didn't say a lot about that because it's mostly military. They got the bridges. But this is a fascinating story. It's about heroism, and it's about something that's just weird, just strange. Well, unless you're Scottish. If any of you are Scottish in here, you're going to love this story. On the night of June 5th, a force of 180 men, oh wait a minute, I'm going to finish the sheet. At one of the many embarkation docks at the mouth of the River Hamel in Hampshire, commandos of the crack 2,500 strong British 1st Special Service Brigade clambered aboard 22 landing craft that would take them across the English Channel to Normandy. One of the soldiers was boyish-looking, unassuming William Bill Milne of the Cameron Highlanders, the personal bagpiper of Simon Fraser, a very wealthy Scotsman who owned thousands of acres in Scotland, and who was the 15th Lord Lovat, the brigade's handsome, charismatic commander. Wearing a battle dress tunic and the kilt of the clan Cameron, Bill Milne stood on the bow, took his pipes out of the box, and started playing the old Scottish air, Road to the Isle, as the landing craft steamed out of Solent between Hampshire and the Isle of Wight and into the Channel. A sailor relayed the music over the ship's loud hailer, the way that you communicate between ships by using a horn. Okay, so they put the bagpipe sound through the loud hailer. And the sound carried across the water. Sailors and troops on other landing ships, tense and fearful of what they would face in a few hours' time, cheered, threw their helmets into the air. Nearby warships joined the impromptu refrain. 2 Royal Navy Hunt-class destroyers played A Hunting We Will Go over their loud hailers, and a Free French destroyer responded with the Marseillaise. The only bagpiper and the only killed soldier in the powerful Allied armada, 21-year-old Bill Millen, was to become a singular figure in D-Day lore. Bill Millen met Lord Lovat while undergoing rigorous combat training with the commandos north of Fort William in the rugged northwestern Scottish Highlands. Lovat had also joined the commandos as its leader in 1941. He would become one of the legendary figures of World War II, distinguishing himself in commando raids in the German-held Norway coast in December 41 and during the ill-fated British-Canadian raid on the fortified French port of Dieppe on August the 18th, 1942. Prime Minister Winston Churchill called Lovat the handsomest man who ever cut a throat. At Ansakari, wherever that is, Lovat invited Millen to become his Batman. And I think in British military, that's a name. I think it's a Batman. The young soldier turned down the offer, and Lovat agreed instead to take him on as his personal piper. The War Office had banned bagpipes from leading troops into action after the great losses in the Western Front of World War I. But Lovat, descended from a long line of Scottish warriors, had a mind of his own. Ah, end quote. But that's the English War Office, he told Millen with a sly twinkle. You and I are Scottish, that doesn't apply. Early on the gray, windy morning of Tuesday, June 6, 1944, the Allied Armada started off the English coast after batting through the choppy English Channel. It was a rough, wet crossing for the troops and landing ships and assault boats, and most of them were so seasick that they couldn't wait to get ashore. No matter what dangers awaited them, Piper Millen was no exception. I didn't care what was going on ashore, he reported. I just wanted to get off that bloody landing craft. Bucking the heavy seas, the landing craft carried the assault troops of the British 3rd Infantry Division. Shortly after 7 p.m., they landed on 3-mile-long Sword Beach. The division's main objective was to link up with the men of General Windy Gale's British 6th Airborne Division, who had dropped just after midnight to secure the 2 strategic bridges of Pegasus and Horse. The Red Beret paratroopers, the first Allied troops in action on D-Day, were holding the spans against German counterattacks. The task of reaching the bridges fell to Lord Lovat's brigade. They went ashore under fire near Culloden. His commandos had discarded the helmets in the last moment and donned their distinctive green berets. Now, why do you get rid of a helmet to protect you, put on a beret? Only they can answer that question. And Lovat led the men off the landing craft, and and Millen was glad because the commander, over 6 feet tall, would show how deep the water was. And he was following the commander off the boat. The man just behind Lovett received a bullet in the face and collapsed. Millen jumped into the water up to his armpits, and the cold shocked him as his kilt spread around him. Pretty cold. The man behind him was hit and sank into the sea. As Millen floundered toward the beach, Lovat turns back to him and says, "Get up!" Shivering and waist deep in the water, Millen put his mouthpiece to his lips and started playing as he struggled through the surf. The bodies of fallen soldiers drifting in the water next to him. The pipes heartened Lovat, who turned and gave Millen a thumbs-up signal because the tune was a favorite march of his old regiment, the Scottish Guards. When he reached the water's edge, Millen could hardly believe his ears when his commander, standing on the sand with the brigade major, asked him if he would mind piping the rest of the commandos ashore. So he turned around and he played the Road to the Isles. That sounded rather ridiculous to me, to play the bagpipe and entertain people, just like on Brighton Sands in peacetime, Millen recalled later. Anyway, I started the pipes up and marched up and down. Amid the thump of mortars, shouts, and whine and machine gun fire, Millen strolled coolly back and forth along the beach while men streamed past him. Most of the astonished soldiers on the beach cheered and waved when they heard the pipes, a time-honored morale booster in British Army annals. "That's the stuff, Jock," yelled one commando, but some soldiers on Swords Beach regarded it as insane behavior. One sergeant shouted, "Get down, you damn bugger! You're attracting attention to us." From then on, Bill Millen was known to many as the Mad Piper. One D-Day veteran recalled, "I shall never forget hearing the skirl of Bill Millen's pipes." That's got to be an Irish or a Scottish term. "It's hard to describe the impact it had. It gave us a great lift and increased our determination. As well as the pride we felt, it reminded us of home and why we were there fighting for our lives and those of our loved ones." I'm not done. For Lord Lovat and his men, there was no time to be lost. They had been ordered to reach the paratroopers at the bridges that we just talked about, without delay and avoiding confrontations with the enemy if possible. The brigade had to cover 6 miles in 3.5 hours. Lovat was determined to get there on time, for he had promised General Gale that he would be at the bridges at noon. Lovat knew that the men holding the 2 vital bridges were hanging on by their fingernails. But their ammunition was low, and after repulsing several German assaults, an armored counterattack was feared at any time. Using some lightweight bicycles, the Brits, when they landed on this beach, believe it or not, landed with hundreds of bicycles. And they were supposed to get on these bicycles and pedal their way to Caen. Now, I'm not certain, I read about this a little bit, and they've defended it in a variety of ways, but it seems to me like it doesn't make much sense to me. But using some lightweight bicycles and commandeered horse and wagons to pull some of their gear, Lovat and his men followed a route carefully selected to avoid main road and enemy strong points. With Lovat striding along, casually twirling his wading stick, whatever that is, and Bill Millen playing his pipes, the commandos trudged up toward Bearville. That's the little village right next to the bridges, exposed and always keeping a sharp lookout for snipers. As the column approached the Caen Canal, German fire opened up. Millen stopped playing, and the other commandos threw themselves flat on the ground, except for Lovat, who went down on one knee. Spotting a sniper scrambling down a tree and tried to hide in a cornfield, Lovat killed him with a single rifle shot. Lovat then turned to Millen and said, "Right, Piper, start the pipes again and keep playing as long as you can until we get to Bearville. The airborne are at the bridges there, and when they hear the pipes, they'll know we're coming." Millen started playing Bluebonnets over the border, and the commandos marched on. After crossing marshy ground and under fire and clearing 2 enemy bunkers, they eventually approached the 2 canals, the canal and the river. It had been a grueling forced march, and it was now past midday. Troops on the other side of the canal signaled frantically that it was under sniper fire. In his foxhole near the approaches to the Caen Canal Bridge, Private William Gray, a 19-year-old Bren gunner, glanced at his wristwatch. His friend, Private John Wilkes, was lying beside him. Where were the expected reinforcements? Lord Labatt's commandos were almost a half hour late, or an hour and a half overdue. He was leery about lifting his head from the foxhole because it seemed that the German snipers were becoming more accurate. Then, during a lull in the firing, Wilkes suddenly said, "You know, I think I hear bagpipes." Gray answered scornfully, "You're daft." I don't know what daft means in Scottish. But after a few seconds, Wilkes turns and insisted, "I do hear bagpipes." Now Gray could hear them also. The beleaguered paratroopers' spirits soared as they saw the welcome sight in the distance. Labatt's commandos marching purposefully along a dusty road toward them. At the head of the column was the imperturbable Piper Millen, still playing Blue Bonnets over the border. On both sides, the firing suddenly ceased as Major Howard's weary men gazed at the commandos, spruce and jaunty in their green berets. Labatt ordered Millen to shoulder his pipes and play the column, but the euphoria didn't last long. As the commandos started crossing the canal bridge, sniper fire opened up again. Labatt ordered Millen to shoulder his pipes and play the column over. Half across, Millen turned around and looked at Lord Labatt. He was striding along as if he was out for a walk around his estate, the piper recalled later, and he gave me the signal to carry on. Millen was, quote, "just trusting luck that I did not get hit. I could not hear very much for the drone of the pipes," he said. "It seemed like a very long bridge." Millen's pipes were damaged by shrapnel later that day, but it remained playable. Exposed and unarmed, he was surprised not to have been shot. Get this. When he mentioned it later to some German who had been taken prisoner, they told him that they had not fired at him because they assumed he'd gone off his head with battle fatigue. Disregarding the enemy fire, the paratroopers raised a cheer and rushed out from cover to greet Labatt's men. It was a stirring moment for Major Howard's exhausted men. Lord Labatt shook hands with Howard, remarked that they had made history that day, and apologized, and I quote, "for being a few minutes late." It was around 1:30 p.m. That's the story of Bill Millen and the bagpipes. It's a long story, but you can't shorten it very much. Now, this is an incredible picture. This is still about Bill Millen. This is an actual shot from the landing D-Day morning. You can't see, there's some houses you can barely make out from here. Some houses up here. Here's some tanks and so forth on the beach. This is Bill Millen and his bagpipes. He's getting off of the boat, and the ramp has just gone down, one of those Higgins Boats. And you see the men getting off and going to shore. This guy right here is Lord Labatt. So, under fire, he's getting off the boat, and the commander of the commandos is already off, and they're getting ready for land. Incredible, incredible picture. Now, one of the things he did after this escapade we just described is Labatt, when where troops were at ease, they were resting, he would have Millen go out among these guys that were resting and play the bagpipes. And he did that for hours within the next couple of weeks. Just an incredible story. Well, we'll leave it there. And we're going to conclude with another fascinating fellow. Do you know who this is? If you know U.S. presidents, you might recognize him. He's President Teddy Roosevelt's son, Teddy Roosevelt Jr. And you notice that he's got a cane. Well, this is about Utah Beach, and he's number 6 on your list. He's the last. So he's over on Utah. And he lands with the initial group. Coda landed the second group. He lands with the first boat. Now, Utah Beach was not nearly as bloody as Omaha, not even remotely close. So there was a modest amount. There was only 140 some killed on the first day on Utah, and there were 2,900 Americans killed on Utah. So it really was. But anyway, they're under fire, and he lands with the initial group. And he utters a famous statement right from the beginning. When they land, they figure out they're a mile and a half from where they're supposed to be. I think they identified a church back up the beach, right off the beach, and they go, that's where we're supposed to be. So now what are they going to do? Well, he is a brigadier general, and he's the highest ranking man on the beach. And he says, we'll start the war from right here. Instead of going back down the beach and doing what they're supposed to do, and they have all kinds of objectives down there by that church. He said, we're going to start right here. At age 56, Roosevelt, the son of President Roosevelt, was not only the oldest soldier deployed during Operation Overlord, but the highest ranking American figure to storm the beaches. He did so with only a cane and a pistol. A veteran of the First World War, Roosevelt was among the first doughboys to land in France in 1918, seeing action in several of the battles. He re-enlisted at the outbreak of World War II, and he led 4 amphibious assaults from Operation Torch, which was the North Africa invasion. And 4 amphibious assaults from North Africa to the beaches of Sicily and the mountains of Italy. He was well liked and respected by his men. Roosevelt had to campaign hard, however, to deploy during the invasion of Normandy. His superior officer, Major General Raymond Barton, his nickname was Tubby. How would you like to have a general who's your boss and his nickname is Tubby? Raymond Tubby Barton initially rejected Roosevelt's request to enter the European theater and lead the 4th Infantry Division, 8th Infantry Regiment into combat. In a personal letter to Barton, dated May 26, 1944, a couple of weeks before the invasion, Roosevelt pleaded his case in 7 succinct bullet points, noting that I personally know both officers and men of these advanced units and believe that it will steady them to know that I am with them. Amid withering fire from German coastal installations, machine gun nests, and densely packed minefields lining Utah Beach, Roosevelt remained a calming figure, guiding successive waves scrambling soldiers to the beachhead. He was undeniably old-fashioned, undeniably true, and undeniably the last of his father's Rough Riders. You remember President Roosevelt, the Rough Riders in the war against Cuba, the Spanish-American War. According to the American Legion, Roosevelt continued to befuddle the enemy as he limped back and forth to the Higgins boats, walking stick in hand to keep the men moving. A sergeant from the 8th recalled encountering Roosevelt on the beach, in quote, with a cane in one hand, a map in the other, walking around as if he was looking over some real estate. By the end of the day, the 4th Infantry was able to penetrate inland 6 miles, and of the 21,000 troops that landed, there were only 197 casualties. Roosevelt's own son, this Teddy Jr., Quentin II, was among the first wave to land at Omaha Beach, making them the only father-son duo to come ashore on D-Day. Quentin survived the war only to die in a plane crash in China in 1948. Tragically, 5 weeks later after D-Day landings, General Roosevelt died from a heart attack. 3 months later, for his cool valor under fire, Roosevelt was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. And here's what it said. He repeatedly led groups from the beach over the seawall and established them inland. His valor and courage and presence in the very front of the attack and his complete unconcern at being under heavy fire inspired the troops to heights of enthusiasm and self-sacrifice. Although the enemy had the beach under constant direct fire, Brigadier General Roosevelt moved from one locality to another, rallying men around him, directed and personally led them against the enemy. Under his seasoned, precise, calm, and unfaltering leadership, the assault troops reduced the beach strong points and rapidly moved inland with minimum casualties. He thus contributed substantially to the successful establishment of the beachhead in France. Roosevelt is buried in the Normandy American Cemetery and Memorial. His brother Quentin, who was Quentin I, who was killed in World War I, was moved to rest beside Roosevelt and remains the only World War I soldier buried in that hallowed ground. After the war, General Omar Bradley was asked to name the most heroic heroic acts by individuals, soldiers during D-Day. He said the most heroic act that he had witnessed, or he was aware of, was Brigadier Ted Roosevelt on Utah Beach on D-Day. Not a bad, and he was a man who knew heroism. Now, there he is. This was taken back and forth in North Africa. And that's Patton. And that's Ted Roosevelt on the right. This is his Jeep. And if you notice, it says Rough Rider, named after his father's troops, Spanish-American War. And this is headquarters, whatever 11 means. Okay, we're going to conclude. This is the U.S. cemetery, which is near Colleyville. It may be on your map. I don't have it marked. I was there one time, and there's some 9,000 American soldiers buried there. And essentially they collected all of the deaths, and the French provided the land, and the cemetery was put together shortly after the war. Omaha Beach is right here. And it was right in this general area that General Cota came up. No, that didn't happen. But the Omaha Beach is right here, and the troops did come up over Colleyville. The entryway, the parking lot's up here, and this, you can barely make out, has 1,800 names on it. And it's all the American soldiers whose bodies were never recovered. They don't know what happened to them. And so then there's 9,000 and some buried there. It is an incredibly emotional place to go to. And I want to conclude with this one slide, and we'll do Q&A. A lot of Europe has forgot about, a lot of Europe is put behind them. The sacrifices that the Americans made in World War II on the continent of Europe. Not the people of Normandy. I found them universally friendly. I found them still very supportive of Americans. Glad to see them come over. Glad to show them around. And one day in the spring, the school children in Normandy talk about D-Day in their classes. And one of the traditions is, and I think these are high school, but they could be junior high, probably high school. They identify an American soldier who was lost in D-Day. And they try to find out his family, as much about him as they can, how the person died. And they go to the cemetery, and they put out roses. And there's one right there. And there's another one right, you can hardly see them. It's a foggy day, but the school children are out in the cemetery. That's D-Day. Any questions? Be happy to answer any questions you have. Yes?
What put the Roosevelt gentleman on a cane?
Pardon?
He was on a cane.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Why? What happened?
You know, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know why. I don't know whether it was a previous.
Would you repeat the question?
Somebody back there know?
I think he had a pretty severe case of rheumatoid arthritis.
Arthritis, that is true.
Been out there.
Yeah.
Cane to even maneuver.
Yeah. And he was also diabetic, I think. Yeah. I got his bio here, I just didn't get it out, but I think it did say arthritis. He was a little guy, wasn't a very big guy.
Yeah, it looked like he was.
Yeah, yeah, very little guy. Further questions?
Just a statement, thank you for the presentation.
What's that?
Thank you for the presentation.
Well, thank you. I'm pleased to be here, and I'll be happy to stay around if you want to talk.
Thank you so much. Wonderful as always. Coming up on June 26th, we're showing a Nancy Drew movie. For those of you that remember Nancy Drew, we're showing the detective movie. And then next month's LDS is going to be John Armstrong. He's going to talk, he's been doing a lot of research on the history of Wesley Church. So he's going to do a talk about all the research he's found about the history of the church. Great, thank you very much and see you next time.